talked about some physical growth patterns, but this is a psychology course, so now we're going to talk about neurological development or brain development in our lifespan. And we have to point out that we are paying attention to 3 different types of neurons, and as they develop, there's the sensory neurons, the motor neurons, and the interneurons. Basically, a sensory neuron is the neurons that take information from our senses to our brain. These are the neurons at the back of the eye, in the inner ear, in our skin, in our taste buds, and in our olfactory bulb that take information to our central nervous system. Then we have our motor neurons. So you can think of motor as muscle for most of this course. And these are the neurons that take information from our brain and relay it to our muscles. You need a motor neuron to move your hand. And an interneuron is not a sensory or a motor neuron. It's not the input or output system, but rather it's the neurons in the central nervous system that do things like decision making or memory or understanding your feelings or judging if something's dangerous. So it's not so much about taking information in or sending information out, but more so just bringing information around the brain. So again, if you saw a glass of water with your eyes, the sensory neurons at the back of your eyes would take that image up to your brain. The inner neurons in your brain would say, do I want that glass of water? After the inner neurons in your brain decide that you want the glass of water, they send information to your motor neurons, which allows you to grab the glass of water. For our first step here, we're really going to talk about interneurons and how interneurons develop. And so the development of neurons is known as neurogenesis. And most of our neurogenesis actually occurred before birth. It occurred in prenatal development. That is, when an infant is first born, they actually have most of their neurons in their central nervous system present. There's a few exceptions, like the memory neurons in their hippocampus. So most of the neurons are already there. But how did they get there? Very early on in our prenatal development, we didn't have a brain that looked like this. We had something that was more like a brain stem. On the slide here, you can think about it as the orange tube I have drawn below the brain. And this is really our neural tube that developed early on in our embryonic stage. And so what happens is at the very top of the neural tube, right at the brain stem, at the top of where our spinal cord would meet our brain, if you will, this is the site at which the neurons are born. This is the site at which where we generate our neurons, or where neurogenesis takes place. And so what happens is there is neurons being produced right here at the brainstem, but they continue to be produced there. So the very first ones that were produced, they get pushed up by the later ones. So the very first ones end up being the ones that reach more the front of our brain or our forebrain, versus the ones that develop later, they're going to hang out closer to the brainstem. So it's almost like a fireworks display where it's shooting stars shooting out of the brainstem and going and moving up into the place where they will be. So at this site here at the base of the brainstem, so more neurons are being produced down here in the hindbrain or the brainstem and then being pushed up into what we know as the upper regions or the midbrain or the forebrain of our cerebral cortex. Another big part of neurogenesis is the insulation of our neurons. And so the myelin sheath wraps around the axons of our neuron and allows for information to be processed faster. What we also know is myelination starts in the same pattern, that our neurons that are going to be myelinated, they start off being myelinated first in the brainstem and then moving up. And myelination happens in different parts of the brain at different points in time, but it does follow this down low first and then up later pattern. And so regardless whether we're talking about the creation of our neurons or the myelination of our neurons, it always tends to start down low in our brainstem and then move upward. But that's how our neurons are made. How do our neurons connect? Now, although most of our neurons are there at birth, they're not connected in the same way they will be in adulthood. And that's because in addition to neurogenesis, we also have to experience what we call synaptogenesis. And synaptogenesis is the connection between our neurons. So a synapse is how a neuron communicates with other neurons, how they release neurotransmitters, and how they have a ricochet effect and a domino effect. So a synapse is a connection between two neurons and how they communicate with each other. And what we find is this is something that starts in our prenatal development, but rapidly continues on for the rest of our lifespan. When you're learning a new language or learning a piece of music, you are creating more synapses in the brain. This is why you may be very tired after you study, because neurologically you need a rest to repair all the new stuff that just happened. However, we find that in infancy, our neurons are not so well connected. It may be the idea that our neurons are there, but the synapses are underdeveloped at infancy. This is the idea that our brain is not yet organized. And so we have our neurons, but our neurons are not talking to each other in a sophisticated manner. Then what occurs is very early on in infancy, we experience rapid synaptogenesis to the point that now our neurons are over-connected. And it's the idea that when one neuron fires, it's not just having an effect on a few other neurons, it's over-communicating and lighting up way too much. Now there's redundant synapses, and now there's redundant communication in the brain that's inefficient. So what happens now is after we go through a period of synaptogenesis, we reach another period of synaptic pruning. And this is the idea that our brain identifies which pathways are redundant or not useful. So this is a use it or lose it phenomena. This is the idea that if you want to be able to be fluent in 2 languages, being exposed to those 2 languages in infancy is helpful because you'll grow the synapses to become more acutely aware of those 2 languages, to comprehend those languages faster. Versus if you're not exposed to 2 languages, you're only exposed to 1, your brain may prune some of the connections that would help you to be bilingual later on. Now, after something's pruned, you could always relearn it, but it's not as easy. And so it's important to understand that while you're undergoing synaptogenesis, that's the peak time to try and learn things, and afterwards it becomes a little bit harder. Now, we undergo this rapid synaptogenesis and subsequent pruning pretty early on in our infancy, around age 1 or age 2. We also undergo it again just before puberty and again in our young adulthood years. So there seems to be 3 major synaptic pruning events that we're aware of. This is the idea if you want to be skilled in something and you're a child who's not yet reached that peak of puberty, it's a good time because your brain is primed to grow lots of synapses and you haven't occurred that pruning. And even if you're a young adult and you want to obtain a skill, now's a good time. Although it's easiest to become bilingual when you're an infant, it's still easier to become bilingual when you're a child rather than a teen, and easier to become bilingual when you're a young adult than when you're an older adult, thanks to synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning also makes us less open-minded as we get older. We become more locked in our train of thinking, become more habitual as we get older. Now this might sound bad, but it's actually really good. Each level of synaptic pruning that we go through actually succeeds in making our brain much more efficient. By the time we're in young adulthood, our brain is extremely efficient, to the point that most people would say our cognitive abilities tend to peak in young adulthood. Now in terms of intelligence, can we tell how intelligent someone is by looking at their brain? Over history, we've considered maybe the size of a brain is linked to intelligence, or how many wrinkles or folds, the sulci or gyri of the brain, may be linked to intelligence. However, it has been proven to be neither of those, but rather the dynamic change in our brain over time. What we've found is not the absolute size of our brain or the absolute thickness of our brain, but the change in the thickness of our brain over time is linked with intelligence. This is such that a child who experiences a rapid thickening of the brain as they create more synapses around age 8, let's say, and then a rapid thinning of the brain as they endure synaptic pruning around age 13, is showing much more change in their brain. The idea that people that are learning more will experience a more rapid thickening and a more rapid decreasing of the brain over time. This is also an indicator that now their brain has become even more efficient than it was before. Versus, just a gradual growth or a slight decreasing is showing that they're not changing and they're not growing as much. Now, in terms of our brain development, it also follows 2 very interesting pathways. How our neurons get to where they are and how our neurons specialize in what they do follows both the experience expectant process and the experience dependent process. The experience expectant process is really genetically hardwired into us, and this is really speaking to the nature or the DNA component of our development. This is such that genetically, there's some neurons in our brain that are going to become specialized for emotions, or specialized for auditory processing, or specialized for risk assessment or visual processing. And this follows genetics because there's some commonalities that our species is expected to experience. This is the idea that there's some environments that will have to use visual information or use auditory information or use risk assessment to process. So many of us have those things in common. However, we also follow the experience-dependent process. And this, as the name suggests, is dependent on what we experience. This can start to shape us as early as infancy, or the environmentally influenced brain development. And this is the idea if you're exposed to 2 or more languages, if you're exposed to really elaborate musical rhythm, if you're exposed to really complicated patterns, or if you're exposed to lots of television at a younger age. So this is the idea that our brain is a little bit plastic and will respond to our environment. It's not just hardwired based on genetics, it's both. So because of this, the experience expected process and the experience dependent process both shape how our brain grows and how our brain specializes in different things. And speaking of specialization, we know there's lots of exceptionalities. We know that our brain has to be flexible for individual differences. And this flexibility in neural pathways helps us to accomplish some pretty amazing things. For instance, we know that individuals who are born blind may use the neurons in their visual cortex, not for visual things, but for things like reading Braille. And we know that individuals who are born deaf or hard of hearing may use neurons in their temporal lobe to process and understand signed languages that other people would have difficulty comprehending. We also know that if you experience a lot of head trauma or a concussion and there is the death of some neurons, that other neurons may take over and re-specialize to compensate for those neurons that you lost. This is the idea that if you have a stroke and you have to learn how to re-walk or re-talk, some of the damages to your brain will never recuperate, but other neurons are now re-specializing and relearning to help you compensate for that brain damage. So this is really fascinating. Now, our brain is most plastic up until age 5 and then somewhat plastic up until age 25. And so up until age 25, our brain is still maturing. One area of our brain that continues to mature even into adulthood is the prefrontal cortex. This is really the area where we make decisions, where we assess risks, our personality, our patience, and our impulsivity. And so this is the last area to really stable off and become what it'll be for the most of our adult time. So our brains are not stable, although there are things that are genetically hardwired into how our brain will develop. They are very responsive to our early experiences. And this is why early experiences matter. Exposing someone to a loving home versus trauma-filled home is going to change how their brain develops.